The Kythera had been floating through the dark emptiness of space for 75 years now. Think about that for a moment. 3 entire generations of people who had never seen a real planet, never felt soil under their feet, never breathed air that wasn't recycled a million times over. Their massive ships looked like floating cities from the outside, but up close, you could see the rust eating to the hull plating and the flickering lights that meant power systems were failing one by one. These weren't some random space pirates or explorers who chose life among the stars. The Kythera used to be somebody important in the galaxy. They had seats in the Grand Councils, trade agreements worth billions, and respect that came with being part of the Hegemony Coalition. But when the mining surveys came back showing their homeworld had been stripped clean of the rare metals everyone wanted, that respect evaporated overnight. The Coalition didn't waste time with gentle goodbyes either. They basically sent a message that said, pack your things and get out. You're not worth our time anymore. So here they were, 50,000 souls crammed into ships that were never meant to be permanent homes, watching their children grow up in metal corridors, while their grandparents died, remembering blue skies they'd never see again. The young ones didn't even believe the stories about planets with weather and seasons. How could they? All they'd ever known were the humming engines and recycled air. Captain Lisa Park was 3 hours into what should have been a boring patrol run along the outer edges of human space, when her communications officer picked up something weird. The signals were faint and kept cutting out, but they were clearly artificial. More importantly, they were distress calls. Lisa had been commanding the exploration ship Meridian for 6 years, and she'd never heard anything quite like these transmissions. They weren't human. That much was obvious, but they weren't like any of the other alien species humanity had encountered either. The signals were coming from an area that was supposed to be empty space, according to every chart they had. Lisa made the call to investigate, even though it meant deviating from their planned route. Something about those broken transmissions felt urgent, desperate even. Her crew spent 2 days tracking the source before they finally found what was sending them. Nobody was prepared for what they discovered. 7 enormous ships, each one bigger than anything humans had ever built, drifting in formation like ghost vessels. The ships looked ancient but not primitive. You could see the elegant curves and sophisticated design that spoke of advanced engineering, but you could also see the damage. Hull breaches that had been patched with whatever materials they could find. Entire sections that were dark because the power had been rerouted to keep life support running. Lisa's first officer wanted to maintain distance and call for backup, which would have been a smart play according to every manual ever written. But those distress signals weren't automated beacons. They were voices. Actual people calling for help in a language nobody understood, but in tones that translated perfectly across species lines. Fear, hope, desperation, and the kind of exhaustion that comes from fighting a losing battle for too long. The first contact protocols were clear about approaching unknown alien vessels. Take it slow. Establish communication from a safe distance. Wait for the diplomats and the scientists to figure out if they were friend or foe. But protocols don't account for everything. They don't account for the moment when you realize you're looking at an entire civilization that's slowly dying while you watch from the sidelines. Lisa made the call that would change human history forever. She ordered the Meridian to dock with the largest of the alien ships and prepared to meet whatever was waiting inside. Her security team wasn't happy about it. Her science team was excited beyond words, and Lisa herself was terrified and exhilarated in equal measure. The airlock opened to reveal something that took everyone's breath away. The Kythera didn't look like any alien species from the movies or books. They were tall and graceful, with skin that seemed to be made of living crystal that caught and refracted light in ways that shouldn't have been possible. But it was their leader, Matriarch Valandra, who really drove home what was happening here. She was crying, not just crying, weeping with relief and disbelief as she looked at these strange new visitors who had actually answered their calls for help. Her tears weren't like human tears either. They sparkled and caught the light like tiny diamonds, and when she spoke in her musical language, you didn't need a translator to understand she was saying thank you over and over again. That moment changed everything. Lisa Park had come out here looking for new planets to survey, but instead she found something much more important. An entire people who had been written off by the rest of the galaxy and left to die alone in the dark. What happened next surprised everyone, including the humans themselves. Most rescue operations follow a pretty standard pattern. You show up, help out, maybe exchange some pleasantries, and then everyone goes their separate ways. But Lisa Park looked at these dying ships and made a decision that went against every piece of conventional wisdom about first contact situations. She called Earth and said 3 words that changed everything. "We're staying here." The response from Earth Command wasn't exactly enthusiastic. Admiral Williams wanted to know why Park was risking her crew and ship for a bunch of aliens nobody had ever heard of. The politicians wanted to know what Earth was going to get out of this deal. The economists ran numbers and declared the whole thing a waste of resources. But Lisa had seen Matriarch Valander's tears, had walked through corridors where Kithira children played games with broken toys because that's all they had left. Sometimes the right thing to do is also the hardest thing to explain. Within a month, Earth had dispatched the largest relief convoy in human history. Captain Tom Bradley arrived with a fleet of engineering vessels and enough raw materials to build a small city. The plan was simple on paper. Patch up the Kithira ships, give them enough supplies to find somewhere else to settle, and call it a day. But plans have a way of changing when you actually meet the people you're trying to help. The first thing Tom noticed was how brilliant the Kithira were. Not just smart, brilliant in ways that made human scientists look like children playing with blocks. Dr. Amy Foster, Earth's leading quantum physicist, spent her first week with the Kithira feeling like she'd never studied physics in her life. These beings could visualize 11-dimensional mathematics in their heads like humans picture simple shapes. They understood the fundamental forces of the universe in ways that human science was still trying to grasp. But here's the thing that really got to the humans. The Kithira were dying not because they lacked intelligence or capability, but because they lacked resources. It was like watching a master artist slowly starve because nobody wanted to buy their paintings. Earth had massive factories, unlimited raw materials from asteroid mining, and industrial capacity that could churn out anything you needed. The Kithira had knowledge that could advance human technology by centuries. It wasn't just a good deal, it was the deal of the millennium. The real magic started happening when the 2 species began working together. Tom's engineering teams would propose solutions using human manufacturing techniques, and the Kithira would show them how to optimize those solutions using principles that human science hadn't even discovered yet. Dr. Foster would present a theoretical physics problem that had stumped Earth's best mind for decades, and young Kithira scientists would solve it during their lunch break while explaining it in terms so simple a child could understand. But the most amazing thing wasn't the technology, it was watching the kids. Kithira children who had never seen anything but metal corridors suddenly had human friends showing them pictures of Earth's oceans and forests. Human students who came aboard the ships to study Kithira mathematics found themselves learning not just equations, but entire new ways of thinking about reality. Language barriers melted away as both species discovered that curiosity and wonder translate perfectly across the species divide. Lieutenant Jake Morrison was typical of the younger humans who volunteer for extended duty with the Kithira. He'd come expecting to do some basic repairs and head home with a good story. Instead, he found himself learning crystalline mathematics from a Kithira teenager named Zuaxtel, who in turn was fascinated by Jake's stories about Earth sports and music. Within 6 months, Jake was fluent in basic Kithira and could solve quantum equations that would have made his old professors weep with envy. The transformation was visible everywhere you looked. Kithira's ships that had been dark and dying were now buzzing with activity as human-built power generators brought dead sections back to life. Corridors that had echoed with despair now rang with the sounds of children laughing in 2 different languages. The elderly Kithira who had given up hope were teaching human engineers techniques for manipulating matter at the molecular level, while human doctors worked with Kithira healers to develop medical treatments that seemed like magic. What started as a simple rescue mission had become something the galaxy had never seen before. Not just an alliance between 2 species, but a genuine partnership where each side brought their strengths to help the other overcome their weaknesses. The Kithira weren't refugees anymore. They were partners, teachers, and friends. And the humans weren't just the good guys who showed up to help. They were students, learners, and adopted family members. Nobody realized it at the time, but this partnership was about to make both species far more powerful than either could have been alone. The galaxy was watching, and not everyone was happy about what they saw. The news of humanity's partnership with the Kythera spread through galactic channels faster than anyone expected. At first, the Hegemony Coalition barely paid attention. After all, what could one primitive species do with a bunch of outcasts that the Coalition had already written off as worthless? The Coalition had been running the galaxy for over 800 years, with strict rules about who belonged in civilized space and who didn't. They'd built their entire power structure on the idea that only species with valuable resources deserved a seat at the table. But then the reports started coming in that made Coalition leadership sit up and take notice. Human ships were appearing in sectors they'd never been seen before, and they weren't alone. The Kythera vessels that had been barely functional death traps 6 months earlier were now sleek, powerful ships that moved through space like they were dancing. Intelligence reports described technology that shouldn't have been possible, weapons that bent the laws of physics, and defensive systems that seemed to operate outside normal space-time. Supreme Chancellor Vextar of the Coalition called an emergency session of the High Council. The massive chamber filled with representatives from dozens of species, all of them nervous about what this human-Kythera alliance might mean for the established order. The Zilithian trade guilds were worried about competition. The Mordak military clans saw a potential threat to their dominance. The crystalline hierarchies feared that their technological superiority was being challenged by upstart primitives. The Coalition's first response was predictably diplomatic, which in their language meant barely concealed threats wrapped in polite words. Ambassador Thekmore delivered humanity's ultimatum personally to Earth's government: stop helping the Kythera, end the partnership immediately, and submit to Coalition oversight of all future alien contact, or face the consequences. Earth's response was delivered by President Chun, who had exactly 2 words for the Coalition's demands. The second word was off. Economic warfare came next. The Coalition controlled most of the major trade routes in the galaxy, and they used that power to strangle human commerce. Ships carrying human goods were turned away from Coalition ports. Trade agreements that had taken decades to negotiate were canceled overnight. The message was clear: fall in line or be cut off from galactic civilization entirely. But the Coalition had made a fundamental miscalculation. They assumed that humans would fold under economic pressure, like most species did. They didn't understand that humans had a stubborn streak a mile wide, and they definitely didn't understand what the Kythera brought to the table. While Coalition bureaucrats were busy congratulating themselves on their economic pressure campaign, something extraordinary was happening in the workshops and laboratories of a human Kythera alliance. Admiral Jack Morrison had been skeptical when Earth Command assigned him to oversee the integration of Kythera technology into human fleet designs. He was an old-school military man who believed in armor plating and big guns. But when Kythera engineer Velthys showed him how to fold space-time around a ship's hull, making it effectively untouchable by conventional weapons, Morrison became a true believer overnight. The first prototype vessels were unlike anything anyone had ever seen. They looked almost alive, with hulls that seemed to flow and shift like liquid metal. Dr. Rebecca Stone, the lead human physicist on the project, couldn't even explain half of what these ships could do. They could phase in and out of normal space, appear in multiple locations simultaneously, and move at speeds that made faster-than-light travel look sluggish. But the real game-changer was the strategic planning. Humans were good at tactics. They could think on their feet, adapt to changing situations, and come up with creative solutions under pressure. The Kythera were masters of strategy on a level that most species couldn't even comprehend. Coordinator Zywix Thalen could calculate battle scenarios across 12 different dimensional planes simultaneously, predicting enemy movements weeks in advance, while accounting for variables that other species didn't even know existed. When the Coalition finally decided to move from economic pressure to military action, they thought they were dealing with the same humans they dismissed as primitives just a year earlier. Fleet Admiral Gortheke assembled the largest Coalition armada in over 2 centuries, confident that overwhelming firepower would end this rebellion quickly and decisively. The first battle lasted exactly 17 minutes. Coalition forces found themselves facing an enemy that seemed to exist partially outside normal reality. Human Kythera vessels appeared and disappeared like ghosts, struck from impossible angles, and coordinated their attacks with precision that suggested they were sharing a single mind. When Coalition ships tried to retreat, They discovered that their enemies had somehow surrounded them in dimensions they didn't even know existed. By the time the surviving coalition vessels limped back to report what had happened, word was already spreading throughout the galaxy. The unstoppable hegemony coalition had been defeated by a partnership between cast-off refugees and upstart humans. Suddenly, every oppressed species in the galaxy was looking at this alliance and wondering if maybe, just maybe, things didn't have to stay the way they'd always been. The coalition wasn't just facing a military defeat. They were facing collapse of everything they'd built their power on. The war that followed wasn't like anything the galaxy had seen before. For 8 centuries, coalition conflicts had been predictable affairs. Massive fleets would meet in open space, exchange fire for a few hours, and whoever had the bigger guns and thicker armor would win. The coalition had perfected this formula, building ships that were essentially flying fortresses designed to overwhelm any opponent through sheer firepower. But Admiral Kate Thompson wasn't playing by those rules. She'd grown up reading about human military history, from ancient naval battles to modern warfare, and she understood something the coalition had forgotten. Wars aren't won by the side with the best equipment. They're won by the side that adapts fastest to changing circumstances. When Coalition Fleet Marshal Korthak brought his armada to crush the Human-Kithir alliance, he expected a traditional battle. Instead, he got a masterclass in how creative thinking could overcome raw power. The first major engagement happened near the Epsilon Centauri system. Korthak deployed his standard battle formation, heavy dreadnoughts in the center, supported by cruiser wings and surrounded by a screen of destroyers. It was a formation that had conquered dozens of species over the centuries. Kate looked at it and smiled because she'd been waiting for exactly this moment. The Human-Kithira ships didn't charge in to meet the coalition fleet head-on. Instead, they seemed to dissolve into space itself. One moment they were there, the next they were gone, only to reappear inside the coalition formation where no enemy ship should have been able to go. Coalition gunners found themselves firing at targets that existed in multiple locations simultaneously, while their own ships were being hit by weapons that struck from directions that shouldn't have existed. Commander Luis Rodriguez was piloting one of the new hybrid fighters when he watched a coalition dreadnought try to target his squadron. The massive ship's gun swiveled to track them, charged up with enough energy to vaporize a small moon, and fired. The energy beams passed right through Luis and his wingmates like they were ghosts. A split second later, the dreadnought shuddered as return fire struck it from angles its designers never thought to armor against. But the real shock for the coalition wasn't the technology. It was the coordination. Kithir's strategic minds were linked together in ways that allowed them to process battlefield information faster than any computer system the coalition had ever built. Human pilots and captains, meanwhile, brought an unpredictability that made their tactics impossible to counter. Every time coalition forces thought they'd figured out the alliance's strategy, the humans would throw in some completely unexpected move that turned the entire battle upside down. The war might have stayed between the coalition and the Human-Kithir alliance, but word of what was happening spread to the galaxy faster than anyone expected. On 1,000 different worlds, in forgotten corners of space where the coalition's rejects had been left to fade away, desperate people suddenly had hope for the first time in generations. The Mordaki were the first to reach out. Their entire species had been reduced to a few hundred survivors living in ramshackle shelters after their sun went supernova. The coalition had promised to relocate them, then decided it wasn't cost-effective and left them to die in the ruins of their solar system. When Admiral Thompson received their transmission, she didn't hesitate. Human colony ships loaded with supplies were dispatched immediately, while Kithir scientists worked on technology to help terraform new worlds for the displaced species. Next came the Zilithans, and their story made even hardened military officers angry. These beings had natural telepathic abilities that made them incredibly valuable as communication specialists and strategic coordinators. The coalition had decided that instead of treating them as equals, it was easier to simply enslave the entire species and use them as living computers. When Zilithian refugees managed to escape and contact the Alliance, Lieutenant Colonel Danny Park led a rescue mission that freed thousands of telepathic slaves from coalition labor camps. Every successful rescue operation, every species that joined the growing alliance, sent shockwaves through coalition space. Admiral Thompson found herself commanding not just human and Kithira forces, but growing coalition forgotten and abandoned, the Vectheri, whose homeworld had been strip-mined until it was uninhabitable, the Theshan nomads, who'd been denied basic trading rights because they didn't have a permanent planet to call home, the crystalline communes, whose entire civilization had been declared incompatible with galactic standards because they didn't follow coalition economic models. Each new species brought their own unique strengths to the Alliance. The Mordaki were master engineers who could build almost anything out of scrap metal and determination. The Zilithans provided communication and coordination abilities that made the Alliance's forces move like a single organism. The Vectheri contributed mining and industrial knowledge that helped establish new manufacturing centers in previously worthless star systems. But more importantly, each new addition proved that the Coalition's entire philosophy was wrong. These weren't worthless species that deserved to be abandoned. They were peoples with incredible potential who had been held back by a system that only valued them for what it could extract from them. Under human leadership and Kithira guidance, they weren't just surviving, they were thriving. The Coalition's response was predictable. They declared the Alliance a terrorist organization and began targeting refugee camps and supply convoys. But every atrocity they committed only drove more species to join the rebellion. By the time the 6-month war ended, Admiral Thompson wasn't just commanding a military force. She was leading a revolution that spread to every corner of the galaxy. The aftermath of the 6-month war left the galaxy in a state that nobody could have predicted. The Hegemony Coalition, which had seemed unshakable just a year earlier, was crumbling from within. Entire sectors that had been loyal Coalition members for centuries were now openly questioning why they'd ever accepted a system that treated sentient beings like disposable resources. The Coalition's response was to double down on their authoritarian tactics, which only accelerated their downfall. Commander Ben Hayes had never imagined he'd find himself at the center of galactic history when he'd sign up for what was supposed to be a routine engineering assignment. Now he stood on the bridge of the Unity, the first starship designed from the ground up as a joint human-Kithira project. The vessel itself was a work of art, flowing organic curves that housed the most advanced technology in known space, powered by engines that operated on principles human science was still trying to understand. But the real miracle wasn't the technology. It was what the ship represented. Walking through its corridors, you'd see human technicians working alongside Kithira scientists, Mordaki engineers collaborating with Zilithian telepaths, and Vectheri miners sharing meal breaks with Theshan navigators. Every species brought something unique to the table, and for the first time in galactic history, nobody was being told their contribution wasn't valuable enough. The transformation happened faster than anyone expected. Former Coalition worlds didn't just defect, they lined up to join what was being called the Galactic Liberation Alliance. President Davis back on Earth was getting requests for membership faster than the diplomatic corps could process them. These weren't desperate refugees either. Some of the Coalition's most prosperous worlds were abandoning ship because they'd finally seen an alternative to the exploitation-based system they'd been trapped in for centuries. Captain Lisa Park, who had started this entire chain of events by refusing to ignore a distress call, found herself serving as humanity's chief diplomat to species she'd never even heard of 6 months earlier. The irony wasn't lost on her that the Coalition had spent decades trying to convince everyone that humans were too primitive to participate in galactic civilization. Now those same primitive humans were being asked to help rebuild that civilization from the ground up. The Kithira transformation was perhaps the most remarkable of all. Matriarch Velandra, who had been prepared to watch her people fade into extinction, now oversaw educational exchanges with dozens of species. Young Kithira, who had grown up believing they were the last of a dying race, were suddenly teaching quantum mathematics to students from across the galaxy. Their crystalline cities, which had existed only in the memories of elders, were being rebuilt on worlds that the Alliance had helped them terraform. But the humans never forgot that this had all started with a simple decision to help when help was needed. Admiral Thompson established what became known as the Haste Protocol, named after Ben's suggestion during one of their strategy meetings. Any species requesting aid would receive it. No questions asked about their economic potential or strategic value. It was a radical departure from Coalition thinking, and it worked better than anyone had dare hope. The protocol's first major test came when the Epsilon Collective, a group of artificial intelligences that the Coalition had declared non-sentient and therefore fit only for slavery, requested asylum. Traditional galactic politics would have seen this as too controversial to touch. Admiral Thompson's response was to dispatch the entire Third Fleet to ensure the AI's safe passage to Alliance space, where they were immediately granted full citizenship rights. Dr. Rebecca Stone, now serving as the Alliance's chief science coordinator, marveled at the pace of progress they were achieving. Technologies that should have taken decades to develop were being perfected in months thanks to the collaborative approach that put the best minds of dozens of species to work on shared problems. Medical treatments that could extend lifespans, terraforming techniques that could turn barren rocks into garden worlds, and communication systems that could instantly connect beings across the galaxy. The Coalition made one last desperate attempt to reassert control by launching what they called the Restoration Campaign. Coalition loyalist forces struck at Alliance supply lines and civilian targets, hoping to prove that the new system was too weak to protect its members. The campaign lasted exactly 3 weeks before Coalition forces found themselves facing not just Alliance military units, but civilian populations that were actively resisting their former oppressors. Commander Hayes watched the final Coalition surrender from Unity's bridge, surrounded by beings from dozens of different worlds who had chosen cooperation over domination. The Kythera strategic coordinator, who had become his closest friend, was calculating probable outcomes for the post-war galaxy, while human engineers worked with alien scientists to plan the reconstruction efforts that would be needed. The galaxy that emerged from the ashes of the Coalition war was fundamentally different from anything that had come before. It wasn't perfect. No system involving dozens of different species with their own needs and cultures could be. But it was based on the revolutionary idea that every sentient being deserved a chance to thrive, regardless of what resources they could offer or how powerful their military was. Years later, historians would argue about the exact moment when the old galactic order died and the new one was born. But Ben Hayes knew the answer. It had died the moment Captain Lisa Park heard a distress call and decided that protocols mattered less than people. Everything else had just been the inevitable result of humans doing what they did best, refusing to give up on anyone, no matter how hopeless the situation seemed.